kings and rulers cast down, appointing all boundaries and times. The power he gives to whomever he will, but he has not control from on high. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. Our God, the Most High God, doth rule in the kingdom of man. The proud he collapses, the holy he saves, submission of hearts he demands. The nations who willingly humble themselves will be the dominions that stand. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. Our God, the Most High God, doth rule in the kingdom of man. A stone from a mountain cut out without hands, his kingdom will never be conquered. Against it hell's gate shall never prevail, his throne will be left to no other. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. Our God, the Most High God, doth rule in the kingdom of man. That throne sits on high in the depths of men's hearts, won over by willing surrender. A warfare with weapons to carnal affair, no tyrant our king but our Father. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. Our God, the Most High God, doth rule in the kingdom of man.
Hebrews chapter 11, verses 29 through 31. By faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell, after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. The city of Jericho is a very well-known city from the Bible, and it's one that has been around for thousands of years. Well, today, I want us to take a look at the city of Jericho and kind of see two main stories from it. The first one's going to be very familiar, and the second one, it's going to be a familiar story, but you probably didn't remember that it happened in Jericho. Let's start with this first one. Whenever I say Jericho, you probably think of... I was purposely giving you just a little bit of time to think about it. The walls came tumbling down. That's what we oftentimes think about, because Joshua was there, and the walls of Jericho, they did come tumbling down. So let's take a look at the scriptures about that story of Jericho. But before we get to the walls, let's back up just a little bit. In Joshua chapter 2, verse 1, now we're going to read about the person of Joshua. He is the one who took over the leadership from Moses. And the first part of Joshua, definitely the first chapter, is all about how the Spirit of God kind of passed on from Moses and went to Joshua, and just like how the Lord was with Moses, now he's with Joshua. So all this is talking about how Joshua, he's the one who's in charge. He's the one who's doing the will of God. And in Joshua chapter 2, verse 1, we read that then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. So this is kind of a pretty familiar story found in Joshua 2 about how these spies, they go into the land and they were able to find refuge in the house of Rahab. Now, Rahab was the one who not only hid them, but she also kind of pointed the king's guards whenever they came looking for these spies. She pointed them in the wrong direction. And the spies were able to live their lives. And because of that, the spies made an agreement with Rahab. In verses 9 through 11, listen to what Rahab said to the spies. Verses 9 through 11, Rahab said to the spies, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now, it's amazing because Rahab, she is not of the nation of Israel. Okay? She is in the land of Israel. Well, what's going to be the land of Israel. Right now, it's the land of Canaan. And she's a Canaanite. She is in the city of Jericho. And she says to the spy that she knows the Lord that they serve is going to give them this land, or really the way that she said it is, has already given you this land. They had heard, verse 10, she says that, we have heard about what the Lord has done. Yet the crossing of the Red Sea, that's something that people talk about not just today, but they talked about then too. News of that spread. And she made that wonderful statement of faith in verse 11 that the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. She became a believer in the one true God of the Bible. And because of that, if you continue to read, you find that the agreement was that her life would be spared because she spared the lives of the spies. Now, when we get to Joshua chapter 6, we find out the spies have come back, they've reported everything, and now all of Israel is going upon Jericho, and they are about to conquer the land. Now, the very important thing about Jericho is this was the first land that they were going to get into in the promised land. This was in the land of Israel, where God had promised that they were going to succeed and that all this land was going to be theirs. But Jericho was the very first place that they were going to be. And because of that, what Jericho was done is it was devoted to the Lord. That's a phrase that's going to be used right here. And that means that it's kind of like this first fruits of the land. And because of that, it's all supposed to go to God. None of it was supposed to be kept for them. In fact, it's either going to be given directly to the Lord or things are going to be destroyed. That's just what they do and what they're called to do whenever they get to the city of Jericho. The only exception to that is Rahab and whoever is with her family in her home at that time. So in Joshua chapter 6, we pick up in verse 1 and we read this. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in. Now, I don't think I have to tell you this, but I'm going to anyways. This is not a standard form of battle. That's why the Lord says in verse 2, I have delivered Jericho into your hands. Just because the Lord gave Jericho into their hands, it didn't just mean that they could just sit back and do nothing. If they had sat back and done nothing, really Jericho wouldn't have been delivered into their hands. So sometimes even the Lord doing the bulk of the work, it still means we've got to do something. In this case, they had to do something that didn't really make sense because, well, it's securely barred, it's a walled city, there's no way for them to get in, but God says, I've delivered Jericho into your hands. And then the plan of attack is to march around the city. That does nothing for it. I mean, you do that for 6 days. That really does nothing. Physically speaking, that's not going to overtake the city. And then on the 7th day, you march around it 7 times. What is that going to do? Well, you probably know the story, but let's keep reading anyways. Verses 14 through 16. So on the 2nd day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. That's exactly what they were supposed to do. Verse 15. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Now, just think about this. If you were part of this army, would you be able to have enough faith in God that even though you've marched around this city 7 different days and you've marched around it 7 times on this last day, you haven't seen any success. You haven't seen anything actually happening. But yet, would you have enough faith to shout for the Lord has given you the city? Verses 17 through 19 of Joshua 6. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who were with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. That's what I was telling you before. All of this whole city is to be devoted to the Lord. That is why it was either to be directly given to God or it was supposed to be destroyed. The city and all that is in it, every single thing or every single person that's in it is devoted to the Lord. Once again, either given directly to God or destroyed. Those were really the only options, except Rahab. There was a moment in which you see in the person of Rahab, because of her faith, that she was spared and her whole family was spared. We also might even say she was delivered or she was saved during this time. Jericho and the walls of Jericho, whenever they came tumbling down and whenever the city was destroyed, we see there was still a moment of salvation in all of that, even for one who was an inhabitant of that original city of Jericho. In verse 25, we read again and are reminded, but Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. In fact, if you kind of fast forward into the New Testament, you'll find out that Rahab is specifically listed in the genealogy, the family tree of Jesus himself, because she is one who didn't start off as an Israelite, but because of her faith in God, she fully became a part of the family of God. That can speak volumes about what it means to receive salvation when it comes to God. This is the familiar story. This is the one that we're used to, about the walls and how they just all came down and how the army rushed in and how the city was completely conquered. Now, the next story that we're going to look actually comes from the New Testament. I said if you fast forward, you see that part of the line of Jesus was Rahab. Now, this took place a long time before Jesus ever walked on this earth, but whenever Jesus walked on the earth, the city of Jericho actually still existed at that time. In Luke chapter 19, we get an amazing story, but notice where Jesus is located. Verses 1 through 4 of Luke 19. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Now, you probably know the story of Zacchaeus. You probably know, yes, he was a shorter, like as the song says, he was a wee little man, right? But here, he's a chief tax collector, he's wealthy, and where is he located? Jesus entered Jericho. Now, Zacchaeus, because he was a tax collector, because of his wealth, and because of the way that people looked down upon him, well, he was kind of thought of as a bit of an outsider. But not according to Jesus. See, so many times, the way that we look at things is, we look at it as, well, there's us and then there's them. But so many times what Jesus did is he said, there's us and then there's more of us. And that us would be about who is willing to put their faith in God and who is willing to follow in the footsteps of Jesus today. Let's keep reading in this story, though, because we see another amazing story of salvation with the person of Zacchaeus. Verses 5 through 7. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. Like I said, Zacchaeus was looked down upon by people around him. Now, not only because he was a tax collector, but he was also, this wealthy person, but really, he was thought of as a sinner. Now, I don't know exactly what type of character Zacchaeus had, But I know what Zacchaeus was willing to do. He is going to be willing to not only invite Jesus in to stay at his house, but he's going to be willing to do this as well. Verses 8 through 10. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Are we as quick to welcome salvation for those who confess their faith in Jesus today? I mean, I hope so. And that would be exactly what Jesus did, because he looked at the situation. He looked at this man and this great faith that he had, that he was willing to make anything right that he possibly could. That's why Jesus said, "Salvation has come to this house." Where was his house located? It was in Jericho. Remember, Jericho has at least a couple of different times throughout the Bible been a place where salvation has come to somebody who is thought of as an outsider. But Jesus says that this man too is a son of Abraham. Remember, it's not just about us and them, but it can be about us and more of us. All of us who are willing to put our faith and our trust in Jesus. Because the reason why Jesus came was, right here, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Can we be people who follow in his footsteps, so much so that we can be people who seek and save the lost? Now, of course, we can't save them, but we can tell them the gospel message that saves and how Jesus will save us all. Jesus has already done everything to save us. Our job now is just to tell people about it so that they can accept, and salvation will come to them as well. Maybe Jericho isn't the only town around that salvation could come to as well.
Ready, Lord, I want to be ready, Lord, I want to be ready, Lord, I want to be ready for the judgment day. When the bridegroom comes, will I be there to meet him in the air? And will my lamp be burning bright? Will my Lord find me prepared? Yes, I'll be ready, Lord, I want to be ready, Lord, I want to be ready, Lord, I want to be ready for the judgment day. If the Master comes today, will I be in or cast away? And will he find me faithful there? Will my Lord find me prepared? Yes, I'll be ready, Lord, I want to be ready, Lord, I want to be ready, Lord, I want to be ready for the judgment day. If the Lord should choose delay, will I be true until that day? And will my oil be plenty then? Will my Lord find me prepared? Yes, I'll be ready, Lord, I want to be ready, Lord, I want to be ready, Lord, I want to be ready for the judgment day.